Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 282, Sherlock Holmes's Tours de Force. Well, hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to be forceful this episode?
I am ready to be forceful and to come to the fore and to have 5 and lose 1 and then be 4 and then to put on my plus 4s.
Fantastic. Well, may the 4s be with you. And the force. Well, this is episode 282. As we mentioned, that means you can find the show notes at ihose.co/trifles282, all lowercase. That'll take you to our website. And there, of course, we encourage you to poke around, look through the archives of the show. Look, we have 6 seasons worth of programming. Well, 5.5, actually. We're working towards completing the 6th here. But take a look through those other 281 episodes and see what pops out to you. I'm not sure we even remember what some of them are, so the surprise will be mutual. And you can certainly decide to support the show if you would like for as little as $1 a month. It brings you together as part of this community, and the other great thing is it makes you eligible for a drawing. We do a drawing every month and every quarter. The monthly drawing is for some free back issues of the Baker Street Journal, and the quarterly drawing is for a free annual subscription. And this is one of those episodes where we are doing a drawing, so stay tuned at some point through the show, and we will have some fun at your expense. Well, this is going to be an interesting episode, Bert. You did a lot of the homework for this, and I'm going to turn it over to you to tee up the discussion here and tell us exactly what it is that we're expecting with these tours de force.
There are broad characteristics, definitive aspects of the cases of Sherlock Holmes, and one of them that makes them particularly distinctive is that many of them begin, the vast majority of them begin, with a demonstration of Holmes' powers. And this is so incredibly distinctive. And it is, I think, just in thinking about it, unique in the cases of detectives, as I think back over other mystery authors and their approaches in adventures. And they serve a really remarkable purpose because they grab the reader usually instantly when they appear on the page. And it's the key to the unique world of Sherlock Holmes. It centers your attention on Holmes. It reminds you what's really special about him. And they're also presented in a way that are gentle and human and entertaining. And they get you immediately into the dialogue of Holmes and Watson. And it wasn't until we came up with this particular topic that I really thought about these various dimensions of these tours de force. So what we're going to be discussing are examples from the Adventures and the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, in which early on in the cases, Holmes is given an opportunity to demonstrate his unique gifts, his unique talents. And we'll take a look at the variety of these demonstrations, these feats, these displays that he puts on, and draw some conclusions about this body of remarkable behavior.
And it is remarkable. I mean, we are basically greeted right out of the gate with Sherlock Holmes demonstrating his formidable skills. We take ourselves back to that fateful day when Watson is drowning his fears at the Criterion Bar and runs into young Stamford, who was I think he said he was a dresser under Watson at Bart's early in their medical careers. And Watson bemoans his situation, that he's running out of funds. He's looking for someone to go half in with him as a flatmate, essentially. And Stamford says, "Well, you're the second person I've heard say that to me this week." And Watson wonders, well, who's the first? He says, "Well, come with me." And he takes him over to the laboratory at St. Bart's and introduces him, Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And here's an interesting trivia question. I think we've discussed this elsewhere before, but what is the first thing then that Sherlock Holmes says to Dr. Watson?
The first thing he says is, "How are you?"
That's right. That is right. He doesn't say you've been in Afghanistan, I perceive. He says, "How are you?"
No.
Gripping my hand with a strength for which I should hardly have given him credit. And then he says, "You've been in Afghanistan, I perceive." And obviously Watson is almost, knocked back on his heels by this, and Holmes explains it away. He says, "Observation with me is a second nature. You appeared to be surprised when I told you on our first meeting that you had come from Afghanistan." And Watson just assumes that, well, somebody tipped him off. He said, "You were told, no doubt." But that wasn't the case at all.
No, nothing of the sort, says Holmes. And this, of course, is a couple of days now into the relationship, if not weeks. He says, "No, nothing of the sort. I knew you came from Afghanistan. This is a habit with me. The train of thoughts just ran through my mind. And in fact, I wasn't even conscious," Holmes says, "of the intermediate steps. But I can tell you what the steps were. I said to myself, here's a gentleman of a medical type, with the air of a military man, clearly an army doctor. He's just come from the tropics, for his face is dark. That is not the natural tint of his skin, for his wrists are fair. He's undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face says clearly. His left arm has been injured because he holds it in a stiff and unnatural manner. So where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen this much hardship? Clearly in Afghanistan." Well, this whole train of thought didn't occupy a second. I just remarked you came from Afghanistan and you were astonished.
Yeah, and this is always the thing that we end up seeing with Holmes, as he has these amazing powers. Well, powers that seem amazing to we mere mortals. He seems perplexed that anyone would be surprised at this kind of thing.
But what's interesting about this, even as the first example, of course, and this is, as we said, from a study in Scarlet, is that here, what's remarkable about Sherlock Holmes is his thinking ability, his ability to explore abduction, deduction, inference, come to conclusions. And that's such a mental activity, particularly as people tend to dramatize, or people have over the years dramatized the cases of Sherlock Holmes on the film, in film and on the stage and in various entertainment media. How do you do that? How do you take a mental activity? Well, here it is on the page.
Right.
It's and it's just so gracefully introduced to us.
It really is. It really is. And we're left with that as kind of the stamp on which to build the character that we know of Sherlock Holmes. That was in the very beginning, first couple of chapters, I think, of A Study in Scarlet. So by the time we get to The Sign of Four, we're ready. We know what to expect this time around. And we're wondering exactly how Holmes is going to demonstrate his unique set of skills this time. And here we have another Baker Street scene in the sitting room at 221B. And is this Holmes or Watson that starts off with this?
Watson. This is Watson.
Yes.
Watson says, I've heard, Holmes, you say that. Now, bear in mind how easy it would have been to simply give Holmes another opportunity to identify a characteristic about a person. But now we get something completely different. Watson says, I've heard you say it's difficult for a man to have any object in daily use without leaving the impress of his individuality upon it, in such a way that a trained observer might read it. Now I have here a watch that has recently come into my possession. What can you tell me about the character or habits of the late owner? And Watson, tells us, I was kind of amused at this because I thought this was an impossible test, and I bet that this would be a lesson against the somewhat dogmatic tone which Holmes occasionally assumed.
Yeah, so Holmes takes the watch, balances it in his hand, and as Watson says, gazed hard at the dial, opened the back, examined the works, first with his naked eyes, then with a powerful convex lens. I could hardly keep from smiling at his crestfallen face when he finally snapped the case and handed it back. And Holmes says, there are hardly any data. The watch has been recently cleaned, which robs me of my most suggestive facts. Watson says, you are right. It was cleaned before being sent to me. In my heart, I accused my companion of putting forward a most lame and impotent excuse to cover his failure. What data could he expect from an uncleaned watch? Though unsatisfactory, my research has not been entirely barren, he observed, staring up at the ceiling with dreamy lackluster eyes. Subject to your correction, I should judge that the watch belonged to your elder brother, who inherited it from your father. That you gather, no doubt, from the H.W. upon the back. Quite so. The W suggests your own name. The date of the watch is nearly 50 years back, and the initials are as old as the watch, so it was made for the last generation. Jewelry usually descends to the eldest son, and he's most likely to have the same name as the father. Your father has, if I remember right, been dead many years. It has, therefore, been in the hands of your eldest brother. Right so far. Anything else? He was a man of untidy habits, very untidy and careless. He was left with good prospects, but he threw away his chances, lived for some time in poverty, and occasional short intervals of prosperity, and finally, taking to drink, he died. That is all I can gather.
Yeah, and then you have this wonderful comment from Watson. First of all, Watson says, I sprang from my chair and limped impatiently about the room. So here, you have the first reference of Watson limping, whereas in the prior case, the study in Scarlet, we heard that he held his left arm in an unnatural manner. But here he is limping, and he's bitter, and he accuses Holmes of learning the facts about his unfortunate brother. But no, Holmes, soon explains. He says, look at the keyhole, the marks of a drunkard, look at the dents and the dings on the watch, look at the pawnbroker's marks. And those are all things that Watson had seen, no doubt, but had drawn no inference, made no inference and drawn no conclusions from.
Indeed. Well, let's pause a little bit here and collect our own senses, lest we be as baffled and, bitter as Watson. Save that bitterness for our sponsor.
If you're a regular listener of Trifles, you'll know that we also have another show called I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And of course, we do hear of Sherlock everywhere around the globe, and it's partially due to the BSI Press. The BSI Press has been doing the international series for well over a decade, and it takes you to places that, you couldn't otherwise go without the BSI Press's help, and that is inside scholarship coming from Sherlockian societies from all corners of the globe. You'll find Japan and Sherlock Holmes, Scandinavia and Sherlock Holmes, Australia, Italy, Spain, Canada. The list continues to grow. So if you're interested in what people from all around the world have to say about Sherlock Holmes, find that common bond at the BSI Press website, BakerStreetIrregulars.com, and pick out an international volume of your choice today.
Okay, and we're back, looking to be wowed a little bit more by Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, and we can be. And there are examples. Of course, we've just looked at the two novels, Study in Scarlet and Sign of Four. But the short stories, the adventures, the cases, the memoirs, keep us going. They are a bit more condensed. In Scandal of Bohemia, we have Holmes remarking to Watson, I think you've put on 7.5 pounds since I saw you. Now, of course, Watson has been married in the interval, and Holmes comes to the conclusion that Watson has gone back into medical practice, and he has a clumsy and careless servant girl. And we rapidly find that the reason for these deductions, the observations he's made, have to do with Watson's shoe, where his leather is scored by 6 almost parallel cuts. Someone who's been scraping around the sole to remove mud, which tells him that Watson had been out in vile weather, and that his servant girl, clumsy and careless servant girl, is not up to snuff. And then he's discovered other points about Watson's, his stethoscope tucked into his top hat. And then in Red-Headed League, we have the very first example of Holmes drawing a set of conclusions from a client. And this is lovely because Watson comes into the Baker Street sitting room where Holmes is already in discussion with Mr. Jabez Wilson. And so Watson casts his eye over Wilson, and Holmes notices this. Holmes shakes his head with a smile as he noticed my questioning glances. And Holmes says, well, beyond the obvious facts, he's at some time done manual labor, that he takes snuff, that he is a Freemason, that he's been in China, that he's done a considerable amount of writing lately. I can deduce nothing else. Wow. This stuns Jabez Wilson. And of course, it's because of his hands, the snuff. He's wearing a pin, an arc and compass breast pin. Oh, of course, I forgot, says Wilson. And Holmes has made a small study of tattoo marks and contributed to the literature. And there's a Chinese coin hanging from his watch chain. And then you get, of course, the conclusion one always gets when Holmes is driven to explain the reasons and inferences he's drawn. Wilson says, well, I thought at first you had done something clever, but I see there was nothing in it after all.
And then there's that wonderful Latin throwaway phrase, omne ignotum pro magnifico, which is basically, everything becomes commonplace by explanation.
Oh.
So, and Holmes wonders if he is going to do damage to his reputation by basically giving away his magic tricks.
But then we come to Silver Blaze with one of the most interesting and compelling examples of Holmes' deductive abilities, his observation of the world around him, one that's led many irregulars into lots of writing over the years.
Yes, this is when Holmes and Watson are in the train and they're en route to Exeter, and Holmes looks at his he looks outside, and then he checks his pocket watch. He says, "We're going well. Our rate at present is 53.5 miles an hour." Yeah, that level of conciseness, right? He's so precise with his with his calculation, and Watson, who, as anyone would, says, "Well, I haven't noticed the quarter-mile posts. Now, even if you had noticed the quarter-mile post, could you have calculated 53.5 miles an hour? That's a good question. But Holmes says, nor have I. But the telegraph posts on this line are 60 yards apart, and the calculation is a simple one. Now, there have been many papers written, and I think there is a definitive one from the Baker Street Journal way back when, by someone who knew a thing or two about math, who said the calculation was most decidedly not a simple one. Because you've got to convert yards to feet and feet to miles and then do the calculation with the second, the minutes, etc. It's actually not something that can be easily done in your head. So, while this example is an impressive display of Holmes's tour de force, I wonder if he was just pulling Watson's leg a little bit and just made up something that sounded like it might be reasonable. Because is Watson going to check his math right there? I mean, come on.
Yeah, well, Holmes is remarkably precise. Our rate at present is 53.5 miles an hour. No doubt Holmes went on to say, of course, 10 minutes ago it was only 47.5 miles an hour, and I have some hopes that we will yet see 58.3. But
well, when we get to the cardboard box, and this originally appeared chronologically in publication order in the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. It did not appear in the book publication because of, societal norms. Let's say it was a little too risque and gruesome. However, in the cardboard box, Holmes and Watson, it's a hot day, Holmes and Watson, once again, in Baker Street. And, I wanted to mention something, Bert. You mentioned how the Red-Headed League was really the first example of Holmes using these skills on a client. And I thought it was really interesting because it would seem to be easier for Holmes to use these skills on Watson because he's around Watson all the time, and he knows Watson's habits. He knows his maybe tics or personality traits, etc. So it might be easier for him to note when something is a little off kilter. And I think that's what we see here again in the opening of the cardboard box. And this was repeated in, I think, the Resident Patient. I think Conan Doyle reused this introduction. This is the famous mind-reading incident where Watson says, finding Holmes was too absorbed for conversation, I tossed aside the barren paper. Leaning back into my chair, I fell into a brown study. Suddenly, my companion's voice broke in upon my thoughts. You are right, Watson, said he. It does seem a most preposterous way of settling a dispute. Most preposterous, I exclaimed, and then, suddenly realizing how he had echoed the inmost thought of my soul, I sat up in my chair and stared at him in blank amazement. What is this, Holmes? I cried. This is beyond anything which I could have imagined. And then, of course, Holmes got a great chuckle out of it.
Well, yes, and he has a lovely explanation for how Watson's train of thoughts was read. He says, your features and your eyes are very distinctive. You threw down the paper. That's what caught my attention. And then you sat for, half a minute with a vacant expression. And then you looked at the picture of General Gordon. And I saw by the alteration in your face that a train of thought had been started. And that gets him to the unframed portrait of Henry Ward Beecher. And, et cetera, et cetera. And as you say, this is just in August of 1893, some only 7 or 8 months later, we have this exact introduction, this exact falling into a brown study, following my thoughts, repurposed in The Resident Patient. But it really is remarkable, and it's the only instance, I think, in the course of the canon where Holmes goes into so much detail about what Watson is thinking. Although we will eventually encounter another one which leads to the conclusion of Watson has decided not to make a particular investment.
Amazing! Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, and then we have two interesting but perhaps less substantial examples of Holmes's tour de force, displays of his feats. In Stockbroker's Clerk, he calls upon Watson and comes to the conclusion that he's had a summer cold. And Watson's astonished because he thought he'd cast off every trace of it. And it's because of his slippers. Holmes comes to the conclusion that Watson had been toasting his feet, warming his feet. But it's June, and the only reason you would be doing that, warming your feet, would be because of an illness. And in Gloria Scott, we have one of the most dramatic examples. Holmes is recounting his experiences with Victor Trevor and his father for Watson. And the elder Mr. Trevor has been told of Holmes's abilities. And, he's a little skeptical, and he says, now, what can you deduce from me? Well, Holmes says, well, I see that you might suggest you've gone about in fear of some personal attack within the last year. Well, he's very surprised, Mr. Trevor is. And it's because of a poaching gang. But how do you know it? He says, well, Holmes says you have a handsome stick. And there's an inscription I observed that you'd had it not more than a year. The head of it and poured melted lead into the hole to make it a formidable weapon. Well, and Mr. Trevor says, okay, well, anything else? Yes, you've boxed a good deal in your youth. Yes, how did you know? Is it my nose? No, it's your ears. They have the peculiar flattening and thickening which marks the boxing man. Anything else? Yes, you've made a good deal of done a good deal of digging. I see that by your callosities. Yes, goldfields of New Zealand. You visited Japan? Yep, quite true. And you've been most intimately associated with someone whose initials were J.A., and whom you afterwards were eager to entirely forget. And Mr. Trevor stands slowly up, fixed his large blue eyes upon me with a strange, wild stare, and then pitched forward with his face among the nutshells which strewed the cloth in a dead faint.
And once again, here we have Holmes not realizing the effect that his simple explanation would have on his subject. And he says how shocked both he and Trevor Jr. were at that, and they helped him up. But what a dramatic and wonderful example, and how full of how rich with detail that particular tour de force was.
Yeah, and then at the end, you get Trevor's good housekeeping seal of approval. He says, Mr. Holmes, it seems to me that all the detectives of fact and of fancy would be children in your hands, and you may take the word of a man who has seen something of the world.
Always good to get the approval of a man who has seen something of the world. Yes.
Yeah. And then to conclude, there's absolutely remarkable. We have the double impact, the magnification, the amplification of these abilities, these demonstrations, in the opening scenes of The Greek Interpreter.
Yeah, this is the classic. And of course, this is the statement that opens up our other podcast, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, since you became his chronicler. Holmes and his brother Mycroft perched together, looking out of the bow window in the Diogenes Club, out to the street. And who do they see? And Mycroft mentions to Watson that this is the place. If you're looking to people watch, this is where you want to do it from. And he says, look at the magnificent types. Look at those two men coming towards us, for example. And Sherlock says, the billiard marker and the other? Oh, precisely. What do you make of the other? The two men had stopped opposite the window. Some chalk marks over the waistcoat pocket were the only signs of billiards which I could see in them. The other was a small, dark fellow, had his hat pushed back and packages, etc. And here's where we get into the diagnosis. Sherlock says, "An old soldier, I perceive." And then volley over to Mycroft. "And very recently discharged." And back to Holmes. "Served in India, I see." Mycroft, "A non-commissioned officer, Royal Artillery, I fancy, and a widower, but with a child." "Children, my boy, children." So even in that wonderful volleying back and forth between the Holmes brothers, older brother Mycroft gets the last and correct word.
Which Holmes has prepared us for, because he does tell us early on that Mycroft has these abilities even more deeply and in greater quantity than he himself. Watson, of course, says, "This has got to be a little too much." And then you have the explanation. "Well, surely," says Holmes, "it's not hard to say that a man with that bearing, expression of authority and sun-baked skin as a soldier is more than a private, is not long from India, and that he's not left the service long is shown by the fact he's still wearing his ammunition boots, as they're called," said Mycroft. "He had not the cavalry stride, yet he wore his hat on one side, and you can see his skin is lighter on that side of his brow. His weight is against his being a sapper, so he is likely in the artillery. And then, of course, his complete mourning, his mourning dress, shows that he's lost someone very dear. And the fact that he's doing his own shopping looks as though it were his wife. He's been buying things for children, you perceive. There's a rattle which shows that one of them is very young. The wife may have died in childbed. The fact that he has a picture book under his arm shows there's another child to be thought of." And Watson says, "I begin to understand what my friend meant when he said that his brother possessed even keener faculties than he did himself."
You know what would have been amazing is if there was another person in the stranger's room watching this whole thing go down. You know, somebody maybe sitting in the corner in an armchair, smoking a cigar, and he leans forward after this exchange and he goes, "Oh, the Holmes brothers are giving you the old routine again." "They do this to everybody."
Oh, we should sell tickets.
Well, this is obviously there are many other instances which we can pull out. I mean, just off the top of my head, I can think of, at least the Blue Carbuncle and the wonderful analysis of the hat. But this just takes us through the end of the memoirs. There are plenty of other examples in and throughout the canon. And I'm sure we'll get to some of them in future episodes.
Yes.
Meanwhile, why don't we turn to our big prize wheel, because this is the episode in which we give you an opportunity to win a great prize simply by being a patron of Trifle. So let's get to the prize wheel and give it a big spin. All right, there we go. It's going around and around and lands on number 7. And looking at our list of patrons, number 7 is Kelly Hodges. Kelly, congratulations. We will be sending you some back issues of the Baker Street Journal. And just a reminder, folks, if you would like to participate in this random drawing every month and every quarter, you will have an opportunity if you are a Patreon supporter. Just go to patreon.com/trifles or directly to the show notes on this episode. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Now, I begin to think that my reputation, such as it is, will suffer shipwreck if I'm so candid. Omne ignotum pro magnifico.
everything becomes commonplace by explanation.
Watson, that is a very loose translation.